Welcome to the book launch of Connected in Isolation. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce the author, Eszter Hargittai. Eszter, as many of you know, is one of the most insightful and prolific academics studying digital society, with a particular attention to how inequalities shape and stunt experiences of people online, and what might we do to address those challenges. She's a professor and chair of Internet News and Society at the University of Zurich, and we're fortunate to have her spend her sabbatical with us at CITP. Eszter has a special connection to CITP, having been part of the original founding team back even before it had a name, when she was a graduate student in sociology here at Princeton. And then she's continued to serve us and be really invaluable advisor, and served on the CITP Advisory Council. So we have a stellar panel to discuss this book this afternoon. First, we have Keith Wailoo, who's the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs, whose research straddles history and health policies. Very well suited to this discussion. Next, we have Tithi Chattopadhyay, the Executive Director of CITP, whose research investigates how policy can address digital inequality. And finally, we have Andy Guess, Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton, whose research lies at the intersection of political communication, public opinion, and political behavior. We'll begin with some opening thoughts from each of the panelists, and then we'll turn to Eszter for her remarks before throwing it open to all of you for Q&A. Without further ado.
Well, actually, I was going to start.
Oh, you're going to start. Yes.
That's okay. Thank you. So thanks, Igor, and thanks so much to Keith, Tithi, and Andy. I really appreciate you taking the time to read the book and bring some comments. So I just wanted to start with really just very brief remarks. Wanted to say that I feel so fortunate to be back at CITP. As Nir mentioned, my training was here at Princeton, and it's great to be back. It's been almost 2 decades, which is a little overwhelming. So I already, for my dissertation in sociology, studied digital inequality, which is the focus of this book. But what I never did was write a monograph, even though some people already at that time encouraged that I do so. So even though I've edited 4 books, I never wrote a book. And in sociology, that's still a thing that many people do. So despite having written over 100 articles, that's not something I did. And I reflected at times why I hadn't. And one reason was that I was looking for an angle that would make the topic interesting for people who weren't already interested in digital inequality, and it wasn't entirely clear to me what that angle would be. And then COVID happened, and I realized, this might be it, because COVID was relevant to everybody, and I thought this would be a way to get people interested in digital inequality and digital skills, which is something in particular that I've focused on. And so COVID, in some ways, became a key study for me on a topic that I've been exploring for over 2 decades already. And in terms of doing this work, there was incredible urgency. It's very hard for us to go back to that mindset, I think, back in March 2020, when we all went into lockdown. But you might recall, you might not, but maybe I jog your memory that initially we were only supposed to lock down for like 2 weeks. I mean, in retrospect, this is crazy, but that's how we geared up for it. And so when I realized we should study this, well, first of all, I should acknowledge that the only way this was possible is members of my team, especially Minhao and folks who were absolutely instrumental. I could never have pulled this off, the data collection on my own. But so when we decided, let's do a study, we thought we only had a few weeks to capture 2 lockdowns. And so we worked around the clock. I honestly didn't think at this age I was still able to stay up until 3 a.m. It turns out I am. But it was very, very intense. And within a few weeks, we created this survey, not only in English, but actually also in Italian, French, and German, because we collected the data in the US, in Italy, and also Switzerland, which has those 3 main languages. So it was very intense, crazy time. As again, you might recall, you might not. It's hard to recall. But I'm so grateful that we did this work, because we captured that true lockdown experience that we will never have again. Because even if such a lockdown happens again in our lifetimes, we will have already done it once. And so we will have had that experience. And so I'm very proud of this work and excited that we were able to put this out there. Just a quick note, as I don't know what the comments will be. So in addition to digital inequality, which is the general theme of the book and differences in skills and how those relate to how people are coping with the pandemic, a major measure is knowledge and misperceptions about COVID. And one interesting aspect and finding of this is that being knowledgeable about COVID and having misperceptions about it is not two sides of the same coin, which you might think may be the case. But in fact, at that time, it was possible to be knowledgeable and at the same time also have misbeliefs. So that's an interesting aspect of that time. And I suspect this is partly because there was just so much confusion at that time. Just a quick note on the logistics. So 2020 March is when COVID started. We collected the data in April. I actually had to deliver the book manuscript last year, October 21, right? So it's already been over a year that I haven't touched this material. So I'm just mentioning that to those of you who don't publish books and don't know how long it takes to actually get something out there. So, which I don't believe makes this outdated at all, because again, we captured those initial weeks, and that I think will always be valuable to have that impression for that time. That's all I'll say.
Great, thanks. So as I was just mentioning to Eszter, well, first, glad to be here and to inaugurate, to welcome the book. As I was just saying to Eszter, books are great for their findings, but they're also even more terrific for the conversations they spark. And so I thought I would offer these comments with that in mind. It's become something of a truism the past 3 years that coronavirus pandemic revealed and accentuated existing forms of social inequality, and it's also created new ones, most notably along lines of class, age, race, and work. And we can see it in the realm of health with infection rates, hospitalization, mortality, higher among people at lower ends of the socioeconomic range. Workers, for example, who were deemed to be essential, whose labor could not pivot into the online space, people living in a new landscape of viral circulation with exposure and risk to follow. So the story from the realm of health is about how there's higher mortality among people of color, African Americans, Latinx communities, indigenous communities in the United States. What Eszter's fascinating book, Connected in Isolation, shows is that the private digital world into which many of us retreated and were able to retreat during the lockdown phase, and the world in which we grew, upon which we grew quite dependent, was also rife with existing new inequalities. An extension of existing trends in inequities in knowledge, but also defined by new risks, inequities, and mortality disparities in knowledge, in information. Disparities, she described differences in how people incorporate digital media into their lives. And the book is really brimming with a lot of fascinating insights about the knowledge landscape that existed during that lockdown phase. And as she pointed out, like one of its more interesting and novel observations is that more engagement in social media about the novel coronavirus was linked to lower levels of knowledge about it. So it's a fascinating study, most notably because of its comparative perspective, US, Italy, and Switzerland. And she looks at this phenomenon of digital skills that are needed to navigate the pandemic, everything from, knowledge about, drug delivery of food, access to public health information, et cetera. So there's a lot to discuss here, and I just want to focus on maybe 4 quick things. One of the things that caught my eye was the notable within US variation in the social media platform. A nation where, as she highlights, Facebook generally dominates with lower popularity for, say, WhatsApp than in Italy and Switzerland. But there are really interesting findings within her study about US subgroups. As she points out, minority groups are more present in the less dominated big platform like Facebook. So you have disabled populations more tending to use Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, and WhatsApp. African Americans on Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, TikTok. People of Hispanic origin turning to Instagram and WhatsApp. Asian Americans using WhatsApp more so than whites. So quite apart from the observations about information, I would just really love to hear more about what these variations by ethnic and minority group and disability group mean. What does WhatsApp and Twitter, what do they provide that Facebook does not in terms of, key issues like credibility, friends, connections, but also distinctive knowledge communities? I know it's beyond the scope of the project, but since you spent a lot of time thinking about it, it'd be just really interesting to learn more about your observations there. It's especially important given what she says on page 117, and that is that there are several sources of information in the US that were linked to increasing levels of misbelief, like Fox News, like Facebook, like Instagram and YouTube. So I was just sort of interested in how you connect those two findings. So besides that, I had maybe three quick questions, and they're provocative and broad and conceptual. The first is about studying COVID knowledge. For example, as you say, differences in pandemic knowledge by race and ethnicity in the United States reveal African Americans and people of Hispanic origin having less knowledge about how to stay safe. So your study focuses heavily on knowledge. And my question really is, pivots on something you just said about how knowledge itself was in massive flux at this time. So it's actually very hard to measure what is reliable knowledge, especially at this time, where, for instance, you question people about their how quickly symptoms showed as after infection, or questions about asymptomatic transmission. I mean, it's been a long time since that moment, but I can remember how much uncertainty there was, and actually it lingered for quite a while about this thing called asymptomatic spread. So it raises very complicated methodological questions, and I wonder how you handled it, how from 2021 until today, knowledge continues to be in flux, so too with trust. And I could go through all the different kinds of places where what we think we know has been subject to kind of normal revisiting in the sciences, right? Whether it's masking, whether it's even like understanding that the knowledge you acquire with regard to a particular variant doesn't translate neatly into what we know about another variant, right? So the knowledge environment is itself creating all kinds of perturbations in a study like this. The second question is just an observation about the U.S. portion of this. The U.S. is a weird nation to study compared to Italy and Switzerland. And the thing that draws my attention is just the federal structure, the state-by-state dynamic, and the way in which there are these massive state-by-state variations in pandemic policy and knowledge, such that you can't really understand American ideas about pandemic knowledge without understanding hyperpartisanship and what became known as red COVID in 2021, because the knowledge landscape in Alabama is very different from the knowledge landscape in New Jersey. And a good example of this comes from Kaiser Family Foundation data, which says, early on, there was this well-known gap between like African American attitudes towards vaccination and white attitudes nationally. And so that in May 2021, you have like 42% of whites vaccinated and 27% of US Blacks, a 15% gap. But by July of this year, it's narrowed to 5%, with whites 64% vaccinated and Blacks 59% vaccinated. But the Kaiser Family Foundation found that in certain states, particularly red states, you actually have the African American population more likely to be vaccinated, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Utah, Idaho. So it's a kind of interesting variation that is worth. And my final question is about the backstory of COVID misinformation, specifically the role of social media policy. I'd love to know more about Italy, Switzerland, and US, which is a kind of veritable wild, wild west of misinformation, misinformation and information regulation. To what extent are there different policies in each of these nations in effect circa 2020 while you're doing your study that help to explain the different knowledge environments that are created in each setting? So rather than just studying information as it gets to different populations, to what extent is that information landscape already shaped so that people are exposed differentially and exploited differentially in different national settings? So 3 questions to think about that was really provoked by this really fascinating study. Thanks.
Super, thank you. I think I'll let you, yeah, I think you should all go because there might be similar points or maybe I can draw some of them together.
Yeah, and just based on our discussion yesterday, I do have a few comments, but I also have a few questions. So, and just like you, the pandemic was a very interesting time for people like me that study digital inequality and studied the digital divide. And the book was particularly interesting because you sort of captured the time, like it was like we captured a time where we really never thought we would come to that time where people were going to be so entrenched in the digital world, because for a long time, for those of us that have studied the digital divide and digital inequality, we were told, of course, there were some people that said internet was a basic human right, but we were always told it's different from the telephone. Universal access for broadband was not something we were talking about. I mean, some of us were talking about it, but in general, that was the constant narrative. But I have highlighted 3 things that I thought your book did beautifully, which even after the pandemic, we've been talking about this quite a bit. The first thing is, for me at least, was the importance of going beyond digital divide and talking about digital inequality, which I know we've talked about this a little bit. And for a long time, in a lot of the work that we were doing, I would say the divide cannot be closed. We can reduce the gap, but we really cannot close it. But I really think like what your book highlighted and what we should have done from the very start was to talk about this in terms of digital inequality from the very beginning. And at the very end of your book, you do talk about the bipartisan support for the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that was coming. And part of that also brought back this conversation about closing the digital divide. And I mean, at that point, I hadn't read your book, but this was the exact same conversation I was having with people where I distinctly remember you and me did this event where we, when this whole announcement happened, we got together with these other groups to bring all 50 states together to talk about how they could scale up to receive the infrastructure funding. And at that point, I kept making this, and I have noted it down here, I kept asking people, how does one close the digital divide? If it was just access, it would be easier, but it includes adoption, affordability, and utilization, and this will continue to be a moving target. And the reason this distinction is important is because states will need to invest in broadband offices, not just for the short term, but in the long term. There is a need for public offices and agencies to be present because technology and changing equity structures will continue to be something states and local governments need to keep a close eye on. And that's what your book does nicely because it talks about digital inequality and it breaks it down by talking about access options, autonomy of use, digital skills, and support needs. And it also connects that with socioeconomic status and background, which I think is really critical when you look at digital inequality. You just cannot look at access. On the access front, also, I think your book makes a really important point, which is access is not just about broadband access. I think access, in your book, talks about it quite a bit. Access is about access to devices, but it's also access to just making complementary investments. Can people afford software and hardware technology that they need for their particular task, for their particular sort of situation? Do they have the right kind of space and environment to use these technologies within, right? And people of diverse socioeconomic background experience this differently. It's not easy to take a class online when you're taking it, say, from a parking lot versus if you have a dedicated office room in your house, right? And are we like as a society, as private companies, actually thinking about these varied experiences that people are having. So for instance, if we just assume that some people will continue to have low bandwidth, do we have news sites that are providing content in ways that are friendly to people that have low bandwidth, access to lower bandwidths? So I think we also need to think about this both from not just a policy side, but even for providers of the technology to think about this diversity in socioeconomic background, diversity in use, that I think will continue to stay. And the final thing that I did want to comment on that you mentioned quite nicely in your book, you collected this data online, and you collected this data in three I would say rather developed Western countries. And even with that, you see the patterns of digital inequality, which just goes to show that if you actually study this in the global south or around the world, you probably will see more of these differences and more digital inequality than, I mean, you already see those patterns in your sort of study, but you probably will see a lot more if you went beyond these three, I would say, relatively developed Western countries. I did have three questions that I also wanted to sort of, when I was reading your book, I thought about some of this. When you sort of talk about digital skills and internet skills, I know you mentioned that the European Commission sort of studied some of it a little differently by talking about digital experience. I wonder whether we should be also thinking about digital skills a little differently, because the pandemic entrenched us in a digital experience that most of us have not had. And what we thought were traditional digital skills may not necessarily correspond to having a good digital experience, especially when you're, so why I'm saying this is because in the past, there was like when people that access things online, a lot of them had similar skills. The pandemic threw a lot of people into the digital world together, and that meant interacting with people that had diverse skills. And does that mean that people that we traditionally thought were skilled are now not as skilled? Because one example that comes to my mind is when I work with, say, a traditional CS postdocs, they often completely have a meltdown if they have to use Word. And they were thrown into this world where they had to interact with other people that were using like Word documents to exchange information and things like that. And that actually changes the way you think about digital skills too, right? Like it is about having sort of being able to interact with other individuals with varied levels of skills online as well. So I was curious about your thoughts on that. The next question I have for you is, I know that given the constraints you had, you did a fantastic job of capturing the snapshot of time across the three countries. But do you have thoughts about what you might have seen if you had studied the Global South? And I'm particularly interested in hearing your thoughts about digital inequality in the context of other public institutions present in a country. Do you think countries with weaker public institutions need better digital access and skills because some of those other institutions don't provide them what they traditionally would get through these institutions? So that's another question that came to mind when I was sort of reading about these three countries. And my final question is, since you study internet skills and training, do you think the pandemic in some ways accelerated the way people sort of started working and developing these skills that we need for the pandemic? We had different ways of sort of making sure we worked with extension offices and others to do train the trainer programs and things like that. But now that a lot of people have sort of had to dive into the basic skills, are there things we should be doing differently given that needs have changed, the way people are using this technology has changed, and some of the basic skills may have been acquired by some of them?
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm also privileged to follow two very insightful sets of comments. So I'll try and build on those. I actually first got to know Eszter right around the time that she started work on this project. So I was in Switzerland at the time as well. And so reading this book really just brought me back to that time and place in a way that I was not fully prepared to experience. And, you know, I remember you were telling me about the genesis of this project. I had a sense that you were really scrambling, a real sense that you were scrambling to get these surveys off the ground, and just reading it just reminded me of just the incredible effort, you know, to be able to do this in such a short period of time. And so, yeah, I mean, it's no trivial feat to do 3 simultaneous surveys in this short of a time, like under normal conditions, and on top of just everything that was happening and uncertainty, I think doubly so. So, you know, kudos to you. I'm really pulling it off. And I just want to add that, I mean, you sounded a little bit disappointed that, you know, in terms of like the amount of time that it took from like start to now publish the book, but I feel like I've had articles that have taken longer. So I was like, that seems pretty fast, like 2.5 years start to finish is pretty good. Anyway, so I have a bunch of thoughts. Mainly what I want to do is go through a few of the findings that really jumped out to me, and that I wanted to just sort of highlight as being significant and interesting. And then I also have some questions and thoughts. The first, I study, a lot of my research involves misinformation, social media, so that's where I'm going to start. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to, if anyone can see it, I want to point out a graph in the book. So this is on page 117. This one, okay, 117. So this is what it's showing is basically a U-shaped graph that only appears for the U.S. This is a pattern that only appears in the U.S., not in Italy and Switzerland. And what it shows is that there's a U relationship between the number of media types that people consulted to get information about the pandemic, so count from 0 to 5. And then on the y-axis, it's the number of misperceptions. So essentially what this U-shape is implying is that people who consulted 0 types of information sources had a relatively high number of misperceptions about coronavirus. And then the number of misperceptions goes down as people consulted more types of sources of information. But then as people went back up to 4 and 5, their misperceptions went up again. And I've never seen a pattern like this before in any that I can recall in any research on misinformation. And to me, it's fascinating. To me, it just sort of screams for more analysis. I would love to know what's going on, especially between 4 and 5. So like, is there like a 5th source of information that a lot of people that, most people don't use, but then people who do, go for this 5th source of information, like they just happen to be super misinformed? Is it more likely to be like YouTube? You know what I mean? Like, is it concentrated on certain types of information sources? I would just love to know more about what's going on there and what's driving that U-shape, because that just seems to be a fascinating puzzle. And again, it only appears in the U.S., not in Italy or Switzerland. So that was really cool. I like Keith. Another finding that really jumped out at me was that basically the people who engaged more on social media about COVID, so either people who are having more discussions on social media or having more support exchanges, actually had lower levels of knowledge about COVID. So that jumped out at me as well. But even more, I think, and I think Keith didn't mention this part, was that people who reported correcting others on social media about the pandemic also had lower levels of knowledge about COVID, which is extremely sobering and depressing. And this is also one of those things where, so I've seen the similar findings do exist, but not in such a striking way. There is a whole literature on sort of social corrections, or what is sometimes called social snoping. So people on social media who feel like they're trying to like reduce factual misperceptions of others, in a sort of pro-social way. But this is suggesting that this sort of pro-social intention can go really wrong, especially in times of high uncertainty. And what this made me think about was that there's a potential connection to studies of rumor propagation, right? This is potentially, these are potentially the conditions, ripe conditions for the spread of rumors. When you have people who think that they are providing more accurate information, think that they're helping others, but they're actually inadvertently spreading rumors. And of course, rumors, spread of rumors have been documented in many kind of crisis events, including pandemics. So that also was something that I thought was worth really emphasizing. And I just want to sort of, there were a number of descriptive patterns in here that were super interesting, but just to sort of crudely put some of them together, a picture that emerged for me was that the people who were the most active on social media during this sort of relatively early period of the pandemic were people who were, so the people who were disproportionately active on social media were more misinformed about COVID. They were less socially connected, which is really interesting, right? So they were more alone. There are a bunch of like demographic correlates, but one that pops up repeatedly is people who are more likely to be disabled or differently able. And this sounds sort of crude and unscientific, which it is, but this sort of dovetails with my own sort of personal anecdotal experience of especially Twitter during this time, which is like there was an overrepresentation of views about COVID that there's a lot of misinformation, or at least I think exaggerated posts. There were a lot of people who were expressing that they were feeling disconnected, that they were alone, and there were a lot of concerns by people who were disabled and felt that policy was not speaking to their or was not addressing their concerns. And so, I mean, I think there are positive and negative ways of looking at this. On the one hand, this is not a representative sliver of the concerns of the population. On the other, these are underrepresented concerns, and what is social media if not to sort of give voice to these kinds of perspectives. Okay, just a couple more things, and then I'll leave the rest for maybe discussion or Q&A. One thing that hasn't really gone mentioned is television. So you talk a lot about TV, which I'm glad that you did. I study social media a lot, but I often have to remind myself that TV is still incredibly important for the media ecosystem, not only in the US, but around the world. TV is a critical vector for misinformation. In some domains, I would argue even more so than social media. And I think that comes across in your findings as well.
For misinformation.
Arguably.
I'll
that was my take. That was my take.
I will get back to that.
Okay. So, and one reason I say this is that, so getting to the policy aspect, this was around the time when platforms were getting super aggressive, I think relative to baseline, against misinformation about COVID. When, say for example, Fox News, I think there are a lot of claims that are being made on Fox News that might have been pulled from Twitter. And so that to me is a really interesting comparison to think about. That said, so I appreciated that you gave people the opportunity to report in the survey, not only that they were getting information from TV, but also which channels they were getting it from. So whether it was network TV, Fox, MSNBC. However, unless I'm missing something, I was a little disappointed that you didn't do something similar for like Italy, especially because I think in Italy there are also huge differences between, say, Mediaset, which is like the Berlusconi network, and Rai, which is like the main national broadcaster. And so there are differences between different TV channels in other national contexts, including in your data, that I think would have been interesting to look at. And the same goes for newspapers. We focus on the partisan divide on TV in the US, but I think the partisan or ideological divides are much more salient in newspapers in Europe, right? So, and I know that's true in Switzerland, that's true in Italy. Okay, and then I guess I'll leave you with two questions. One is, so in terms of skills, I like that you had data, measures of both social media skills and digital literacy skills, and you raised some questions about the role of sort of more traditional digital literacy skills and how they relate to knowledge. And I guess my question is, should we be actually focusing more on social media skills? Especially, at several points you sort of raised the question about interventions. What sort of interventions should governments and other organizations use to improve people's knowledge? And so, since for the past couple of years, a lot of people have focused on digital literacy and media literacy type skills, but maybe we should be focusing on social media skills. So that's sort of a question I put to you. And I guess my final question to end with is, if obviously there was a big scramble, you were not able to go into people's homes and talk to them directly. Sometimes I feel like you're almost like you wanted to like get inside people's heads, but of course you couldn't. And so, do you wish that you could have had a more like qualitative in-person component if it had been possible? And if so, what would you have added to your study? Anyway, this is pleasure.
Super. Thank you so much, all of you. These are really fantastic observations and questions. I will go over them. I also want to make sure we have time for audience input. And you post a lot of them, so I might be faster than ideal, but I would like to address most of them. So let's see how well I took notes. So Keith, one question you asked was this issue of ethnic minority groups and other minority groups like disabled adults, which I should mention, it's pretty rare in studies of internet use to have data about this disability status, and it's something I've done in prior years and also in this study, partly because disabled people were one of the especially impacted group, of course, with respect to the pandemic. So Keith rightly observed that some of the less popular but nonetheless popular platforms, for example, WhatsApp in the US or some others like Snapchat, are used more by minority groups. And this has actually been true over the decades. So already in the early noughts, we observed that, well, not early, later noughts, we observed that that different groups, especially by race, ethnicity, were ending up on different social media. And that has happened for quite a bit of time. There's literature on this, why it might happen. I suspect it's partly in the beginning, it was because they were all based on offline networks and how people were connecting with their offline networks on social media, which is how people connected initially on social media. But also trying to carve out their own spaces probably and not being overwhelmed by the majority or I mean, certainly a lot of the conversation about Twitter and all the problems it has is the white supremacy and just problems of that certain groups, also LGBTQ groups face. And so I suspect that's part of it. You could ask the question, well, couldn't those groups, for example, on Facebook find their niche, right? On Facebook, you can create private groups, and that's a good question. And one could ask, well, maybe that's related to skill, and do people know they could do that? And so I think there are lots of questions one could ask. I think I'm going to leave this at that, but it's a very important part of this whole landscape. You raised the question, Keith, of the measure of knowledge, and of course, it's a complicated one and very central to the book. So it's absolutely valid to question it and to poke at it. I defend this measure because we worked with the WHO's website of, like, it's Mythbuster website, basically. The appendix lists not only all the questions we had, but for the knowledge items, the exact data. So everything is in the book. And I'm pretty sure that almost all of those still hold. So one thing that I was very conscious about was I never asked about masking. That was confusing from the beginning. And then first it was confusing. We didn't know, should we mask, shouldn't we? And then it became political very quickly. So I decided I'm not even going there on this survey. That would not be in this. So I think that would be a very questionable knowledge question. I didn't include it at all. So I do stand by those measures, but I fully appreciate that a lot of it fluctuates. And so this is for that time, and I could only go with what we knew at the time. But it has actually held up pretty well. I mean, one thing one could say, because some of my misbeliefs measures, one could argue, are not that significant. For example, is it that big of a deal if you believe that taking vitamin C will protect you from COVID? Well, you could say not really, but on the other hand, it could be if you think that will actually help you and then you don't stay at home because you think, well, now you took vitamin C, you're all set, right? So but there are certainly different magnitudes to what you believe. A little snippet for those of you who haven't seen the book, that one of these misbeliefs is that you have to avoid mail from China, packages from China, and it's a little scary how, especially in the US, it was 20% of Americans who thought that was true, much lower in Italy and Switzerland. Okay, so you raised this question of state by state, how the US varies state by state, which is a completely valid point. One way I tried to control for this empirically is that I did create a variable for having a Republican governor, and I did include that in some of the analyses. And the other thing I did, which I have seen almost in no other analyses, is that many analyses will say, oh, X number of states had, either Republican governors or was something else here, but I did, that X number of states didn't have lockdown orders, I guess, of any sort, but I did the calculation of what percentage of the American population those states constituted, and it was like 5%. So in the end, again, you have to be careful about how you look at these measures. It may have been a bunch of states, but they were all those states that have almost no people in them. No offense to those states, but you know what I mean. They have fewer people than Switzerland, and that's saying something. Switzerland is like 8 million. Okay, so I don't know, that was the same point. Okay, and then your last question had to do with the institutional policy about misinformation on different platforms, and this is definitely not something my book takes on, and generally I don't study institutional policy. This is actually where I would like to pivot to the angle that, and this also addresses Andy's point about television. So from Andy's comments, I feel like the takeaway may be that TV was not good in the story, but actually my takeaway is that television, the mainstream networks really mattered. So, and I'll bring this back to your point, Keith. So one of the main findings is that in all three countries, well, in the US, it's the broadcast network, so ABC, CBS, NBC, and in Italy and in Switzerland, the public broadcasting system are the one information source that one's controlling for socio-demographics that's positively linked with knowledge. That's the only one, none of the online sources. So it's actually very much a TV story, but in my mind, in a positive way. And maybe you're thinking that cable, yeah, you're thinking, yes, so that's fair. But so for broadcast network, and then bringing this back to Keith, the way I bring this back to Keith's point is that in Switzerland, where the trust in the public broadcasting system is very strong, to the point that a few years ago, there was a referendum and 60% of the country voted to continue paying hundreds of dollars a year to maintain the system. So it's a very strong support for the public broadcasting system, lots of trust, and they were very helpful in informing people. So I would say this isn't social media policy, but there is this larger media policy of having an entity that actually informs people that people trust. And that made a difference. And then just the other part of this TV story is that neither in the US nor in Italy do we have an information source that helped people avoid misinformation. Switzerland is the only country where there's an information source that people consulted that links with lower misperceptions. And again, it's the National Broadcasting Service. So I think that it's a different level of policy, but matters there. So I think that is a lesson learned. And to Andrew's point, it's true, I didn't collect, frankly, I don't know the Italian media landscape that well, and didn't get details about the different cable newspapers there. I did, however, have a separate measure of RAI, which is the public broadcaster versus the other. So at least I do have that distinction. Okay, moving on to Tithi's comments. First of all, absolutely acknowledging that collecting the data online is already sampling on more connected and more skilled users. So by definition, the entire data set that's covered in this book is already the more connected, the more skilled. So if anything, all of these findings, even for these countries, are conservative. That if we had other means to reach more diverse population, we'd find even larger inequalities. I agree with you absolutely. I mean, if we went to countries that have even less connectivity, it would be even less. Again, the question is, and you brought up this issue of public institutions and support. I bring this back again to the TV broadcast networks, right? One of the things RAI in Italy did was that they actually decided to broadcast lessons for students. So if people didn't have internet at home, kids, they could at least watch some of the lessons on TV. And so in a country that has a very strong national public system, they can actually do that. I guess it also means, which is also not true in the US, that they also have a fairly uniform school education content in certain grades, presumably. So you mentioned the question of skills. Well, actually, Tithi and Andy, both of you brought up this question of skills, and Tithi specifically, should we be measuring different ones? Do we need to be thinking about other ones? And Andy specifically, should we be measuring social media skills more? And Andy was very modest. He didn't mention that he and his colleague Kevin Munger have done excellent work updating some of the digital literacy measures. So anyone interested in that, you should check out that work. My answer to this is that we need more studies of skills. I think we need way more studies of skills. It absolutely requires more nuance. That said, your study did find that the general internet skills item from 2 decades ago still holds, and then there's another study that was just conducted in Slovenia that it also holds there. So there's still value to that measure that I created 2 decades ago, as crazy as that sounds. But absolutely today, the internet has many, many dimensions. And I have a theoretical piece in which, with Marina Micheli, we talk about the different dimensions of skill, and each of those dimensions that should have its own measure. I guess now I'll do an ad for my talk next week on Tuesday at CITP, where I will be talking about how, in a current project, we're trying to figure out how to measure algorithm skills in particular. And the short answer is it's super hard. So I'm not surprised that there's not a ton of work on this. It's very, very hard work, but we do need it. I think as the book shows, they matter, but different dimensions of it matter at different times. Quickly. So Tithi, you suggested that the pandemic probably accelerated learning and the skills, and people would have achieved certain levels of skill. I'm not sure that's actually necessarily true. I don't think this made it into the book, and it may actually be in so in the US, we also did data collection in May of 2020, where we asked about much more detailed measures of learning and what kinds of learning people were doing. And not that many were doing computer-related learning, though. So I'm not sure it helped. And it was probably very targeted. So I don't know. I suspect a lot of people still have a lot of skills that they need to learn, and I'm not sure we get to now leapfrog ahead, per se. I should say that, and this actually now moving to Andy's comments. So Andy showed you that U-shaped, and actually Mihir commented yesterday of the sort of the match of that graph, previous page, which is also very similar, interesting about knowledge. And I want to say that in 2023, I want to make the data available so other people can actually look at and analyze some of the data, because there is so much in this data set that this book and the dozen articles that are not replicated in the book that we published from this material have only really just addressed a small part. And if that would also allow for people to look at the knowledge, for example, create a different knowledge measure, or, I mean, it's very specific items, but you could index them in different ways. And I'd love to see people use this, so I can imagine in methods classes, it could make for a great resource. So Andy's questions. I'm not sure where your questions started versus the observations. You're right that it would have been great to have more nuances in Italy for things like cable. I actually also wish I'd had the opportunity in the book to get into more detail about specific social media platforms and how, I mean, I do some of this, but you're right in highlighting it's amazing how poorly Twitter looks from, I mean, the story of Twitter in this book is really bad, right? So that it basically links to less connectedness, less knowledge.
Well, it's the kind of stuff that people are always anecdotally complaining about.
Yeah.
Which is like, it really struck me. It's like, oh, is the data backing up?
Yeah. Yes. And oh, and then finally, the question about qualitative data, I would have absolutely loved to have been able to. And there were, and I do collect interview data quite often in my studies, and that is actually the kind of data I'll be reporting on next week for the algorithm skills study. And yeah, I mean, there's so many things in here that require that more in-depth understanding. And in terms of what, I mean, anything from how did people decide what sources to consult, right? Why did they go to this side or that side, or which medium to choose? And I mean, one place where the book comes up short is that I focused, you always have to limit what you're doing. I focused very much on information sources in terms of the media, but I don't have data on friends people are talking to in terms of COVID, right? Like, what are your friends and family telling you? Do you know doctors in your network who are telling you anything? And would have loved to get details about that as well. So yes, lots of questions, and hopefully, I mean, I there are many people who studied COVID, so fortunately we do have lots of material out there, but I think I addressed most of the questions, so thank you so much. And I think now we could open it up if people have questions or comments.
You just want to raise your hand and then ask a question. So while you're thinking of a question, maybe anyone over there, while you're thinking about it, let me then ask a question for the panel, which is, I think, to go back to one of the key findings that Eszter had, which seemed to be that a centralized source of authoritative information was really important. And yet, we're seeing some trends that media is becoming more and more decentralized. And we see that it has certain benefits to society to being more decentralized. How do you reconcile these two? How would you approach this question of how do you create a centralized source on social media? How should a policymaker think about this issue?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that, which is to say that Andy's observations about the U-shaped curve and the paradox of more information not necessarily leading in the right direction. It sort of is a fascinating instantiation of what we know to be true anecdotally, which is this kind of like do your own research phenomenon is actually a misguided path. But the internet invited a do your own research approach. And it turns out that what you find with that U-shaped curve is the more research you do, right? Or the people who believe that I'm just going to do more research. But at the same time, I'm just struck by, it's bringing me back to the lockdown stage in which I was doing research. And I was finding things about how do you properly sanitize your fruit? Because there is this thing called like contamination that happens on fruits. And that was an entirely open area of investigation. So while I take your point, Eszter, that your measures of knowledge were, those which were validated within the world, the WHO. But there's just this entirely huge world of knowledge that was up for grabs, in which all of us were literally doing our own research. And the online environment that you document so well was kind of, I don't know, well, I'll just leave it there and have you fill in what is that online world?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I was going to take it back to the internet or to the television for a second, because I mean, we like to dump on Fox News and they don't look good in the data, but neither does PBS actually. And I think part of it is that cable channels and channels that are mostly about news were really trying to, or maybe PBS in particular, were really trying to give time to all the different perspectives. And at a time when there's that amount of uncertainty, maybe that was not the best policy, right? Versus you have ABC, CBS, NBC, which they do their half-hour news show, and presumably you just get at the absolute core. Like, this is what we actually really know, and just like let's leave it at that, versus 7 hours of what should we be doing. Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, could you just respond to Andy's question about sources number 4 and 5 on that?
Oh, like how?
So which did those tend to be?
Okay, so first of all, I want to clarify that that measure, which it may or may not be as helpful, but so their media, they count up media types, and a media type means radio, newspaper, social media, online, television, right? And so the 5 is the types that are, so you did everything. It's a very general measure. But it's not a from 4 to 5, it's the one thing. I mean, that's, one could go in the data and see, is it just from 4 to 5, it's all the people who also did radio, but I don't think that's what it is. Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's much more distributed. So it's not like most people did newspaper, television, social media websites, and then the people who also did radio are then confused. It's much more jumbled. Like, people are I mean, it could be it could be really interesting to do cluster analysis or something, like a different type of analysis than I did.
Or you could look at the rankings, like in other words, like the people on average, like newspaper was, I think, number 1 source, right?
I don't have rankings in that way.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I don't have rankings. Yeah. I mean, I could, like, you could, there's some nuance in that. Did you consult it almost daily or almost daily versus a few times a week? So you could, that would be a type of ranking you could do, but that's the most you could do. So it's pretty complex, but again, once I made the data public, I think it would be terrific to have classes look at some aspects of these, and students just look at just the info source variable and go at it. I mean, there's so much wealth of data there that I haven't been able to work through yet.
I just wanted also to follow up, Nero, on your comment or question. Can we really, based on this data, say something in favor of centralized communication? Because we were talking Switzerland as one case study, which is also a particular culture, right? It's not hard to imagine one centralized communication would propagate strong misinformation, like COVID denial, for example, in the country, or very strict lockdown for political purposes and so on. So I just wanted for the panel thinks what we can really say based on these 3 countries, US, Switzerland, and Italy, about the advantages of centralized communication in crisis.
I mean, just very quickly, I do want to, when you say Switzerland is a very particular culture, I'm not entirely sure what you mean, because it's not a simple culture, right? It's got 3 different languages, 3 different cultures, and it's a very individualized society in that Switzerland is more American than the US in some ways, of people needing their individual rights and not wanting to mask. And I mean, there was a lot of pushback, and people were not masking on public transportation until pretty late, like in June, that became a rule, like an actual, remember, I mean,
The precise moment that the law changed.
people actually put on their masks. But until then, there were like 10% of us maybe wearing masks on public transport. So I'm just not sure what you meant by that. I mean, yes, it's one country, but it's actually a fairly complex, not obvious situation kind of country.
Yes, it's one country. I was thinking more in terms of maybe countries that have state-funded television.
Yes.
And that propagate one, right? It's probably still kind of an outlier in terms of democratic institution, in terms of education level, in terms of well-being and so on. And I think that isn't very representative of maybe a strong centralized message of a truth narrative.
Is that a question? Because we should probably
I wanted to
So keep going.
Yeah, and then we can go ahead.
Well, I had a related thought, but it doesn't directly answer your question, but I had this question about, how do we sort of rebuild trust? Like, assuming that you think centralized sources of information are important, in situations like this, how do you sort of rebuild trust, and what do these actually look like? I mean, one thing that occurs to me, and admittedly I'm biased here, but I actually think that platforms, like there was and is a huge opportunity for social platforms to actually play that role. It's difficult to, I think, remember now, but in the early stages of the pandemic, especially Facebook, I think really like sort of they consciously sought to step up, take much more aggressive action in terms of content moderation, also aggressively pushing sort of scientific and factually vetted information so that it was like at the top of people's feeds. They're trying to market themselves as the source of authoritative information about COVID. And I only remember like a few scattered surveys, but there was like a little bit of evidence that people, like for a while anyway, had more trusted information from these platforms, because if you compare to the alternatives, right, these platforms were actually saying like, we are going to aggressively downrank misinformation. We want you to come here and trust in what we're showing you. We're going to label stuff that we're unsure about. We're going to provide context. There's really much more than a lot of traditional organizations and governments were doing. I think that all, of course, fell apart over time for various reasons. So maybe it's sort of just impossible to ask for that to just like always be the case. But it also just strikes me as like a model, and something to think about.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that happened was Google also eventually very much was paying attention to what it was listing in response to anything COVID related. I think I'm quite certain that our data collection happened before any of this was implemented. So it may be partly a timing issue. And I hope there were I would think Facebook itself would have done studies, but they're not published probably on whether that helped.
But I thought those studies at that period showed that Facebook's policies weren't really working very well. That disinformation was still spreading more rapidly on Facebook. I can't cite you the studies by name, but I do remember seeing a bunch of things at that time saying that they actually couldn't control.
There was a lot of reporting. There were a lot of people paying close attention to platform enforcement actions around this time. And so just because platforms are so large and there's so much content and a lot of things can fall through, there were a number of reports of like things that were still circulating. And so I would suspect that it's just these kinds of salient examples.
I mean, I would say part of the challenge here is that they're the ones with the data, and if the data don't make them look good, they're not going to publish it. So we want to know. Hank, you had it. Well,
this may be out of order. I don't know. It starts from the view that people want to find the truth, and what they're looking for, what their schools of thought would say, people are looking for information that confirms what they already believe. And the idea would be that, the whole subtext of this really interesting discussion and your book is that if only people had the right information, they'd make better decisions. And it's so political, like Case and Deaton have evidence that in red states that voted for Trump, the COVID death rates are much higher and so on. And that's, and those people are certainly reinforcing with incorrect information and so on. But I don't know that injecting them with the right information, I don't know how you do that and whether it would actually change their behavior.
No, you're absolutely right. Okay, Keith, go ahead. Yeah.
Just building on this question, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask is whether there is any asymmetry in your three cases with regard to the intensity of politicization of COVID information. 2020 is a particular year in what you're describing about how people were reading all things COVID in the US context anyway, through the lens of increasingly partisan politics. Is there anything comparable happening in Switzerland and Italy?
So my first answer to this whole line of comments is that I believe the data collection still happened so early that I don't think it was as politicized that quickly. That said, I know some people were very upset that lockdowns happened at all.
I wasn't challenging what you were
No, I understand. No, I understand, but I'm just saying what these data reflect. That's all. I mean, that's all the data can reflect. I mean, generally what you're saying is absolutely right. There's lots of, it's the confirmation bias research, absolutely. It's when people use search engines, they click on the link that if you have two links that have positive views, opposite views, they'll click on the one that they agree with already. But I lost it. No, there was something.
Politicization in different countries.
Oh, yes, thank you, the different countries. So, I mean, one thing that comes through in the data in terms of behaviors and compliance with lockdowns is that in Italy, it was much more serious. And I don't know if this is because they got hit earlier, and by the way, that is why I included Italy partly, right? They were the first non-Asian country. People died very quickly. It was very serious. And also Switzerland got its first cases through Italy, so it was just of interest. But I don't know if that's because they were more serious. They also had a hard lockdown, not a soft lockdown, which by the way then suggests that these policies matter, right? Because in Italy, you couldn't even go out just to go on a run, which was not the issue in Switzerland and the US, so that seemed to matter. But in other types of politicization, I just don't know.
Good question.
Hi, this is just a more like, I don't know, idea type question, but a lot of your research seems to focus on like these centralized platforms. And now there's this new platform called Mastodon that people are kind of going to because there's this great Twitter exodus ever since Elon Musk took over. So like, what would research look like then if you don't have like one platform, but a bunch of different servers when trying to do stuff like this in the future?
Right, so the kind of research I do surveys where I ask people what they use. So if I were to do this survey again, or I wouldn't yet because I don't think Mastodon is popular enough at this point, but you know, maybe in 2 years if it keeps getting popular, then Mastodon would be one more social media platform I include on the survey. For people like Andy who work with log data, that raises big questions for him, but I don't work with data like that.
Log data?
Log. So he downloads the
If we wanted to directly analyze the posts on Mastodon, that's a great question.
That's for him to have to
TBD,
answer, not mine.
I just wanted to go back to one of your observations, which I thought was really terrific, which is how did the pandemic change the definition of digital skills? So I also got the sense, and once again, I'm talking about, you know, we all have sort of ends of one or two that we can extrapolate from, and I'm certainly one of them. And so I, for instance, I find it amusing that everybody knows that there's something called a mute button now. We've all sort of, and that's like true of my most elderly relatives. Actually, one of them doesn't know where the mute button is. But there is this kind of phenomenon where we all migrated to this space and learned certain levels of digital navigation skill. And I know your study is a kind of a snapshot in time, but how does that influence things like digital inequality?
Right. And so I get back to I think Tithi referred to the moving target, right? I mean, skills are always going to be a moving target, as are services, right? So now it's who can use Mastodon, who figure it, and there's lots of confusion over Mastodon, for example. So that's interesting to observe, especially since those people who are on it are the early adopters. They're really skilled people, and even they're confused. So good luck, general population, getting on Mastodon. So because it's a moving target, the inequalities will exist, right? Because yes, you may have caught up with XYZ, but now there's ABC, and you also know ABC. I do want to push back against one little comment you made where you referred to your older relatives. And so there is this general assumption that older adults are less skilled. And yes, when it really comes to the oldest old people in their 80s, 90s, that's fair. They tend to be less skilled, but certainly 60 and below, it's not obvious anymore that there is that kind of skill difference. So one of my next books is about older adults and digital media use, and that I'm working on with John Palfrey, and so we're gonna unpack that.
Well, I must say that, I mean, some of my older relatives are the people who organized like Zoom memorials and Zoom meetings with far-flung family all over the world, which would never have happened. And so I give them credit for exactly using these digital media. And I see head nodding out there. I mean, that to me was one of those remarkable early developments, is how people were connecting families across communities and across the world through these new media.
Yeah.
Did you find any of that early on in your?
We didn't gather data on that. Our maze survey has a little bit on it, but we haven't looked at it that much. Yeah. So I don't know what our timeline.
What's
Just want to
that?
make sure we let.
It's 4:09.
I think we may be out of time. So, or wasn't it 3 to 4? I just don't want to.
Yeah, it was.
It was 3 to 4, but we have a reception.
Yeah, we have a reception.
So
If-
there's.
If maybe what we can do is, if you can just state your question, then we can carry it forward to the reception. So if you do have questions,
Yeah, ask your question.
ask your
That's-
question, and then we'll go to the reception. Yeah. And I think there's one more over there, yeah.
I mean, feel like you might have covered this might be out of the scope of your research, but I was just wondering, like, do you have any data, like, or like observations about how durable these skills might be? Like, in terms of maybe you've learned it for the pandemic, but as soon as the pandemic goes over, are you going to say, what's it? Like,
Great, and two, okay, we'll do two more, yeah.
So I have one question, and I don't know if you cover this in the book, but I'm curious, like, the market did a really interesting reporting recently on broadband pricing differentials across the United States, right? And one of the really interesting things to point out is in the same city, like neighboring neighborhoods had like completely different pricing approaches, and like some people had like gigabit, like broadband, other people had like, they were on still like 20 megabits per second download, right, speed for like the same price. And so I'm wondering, like, do you have any sort of measures or look at like people's differential access, in sort of like broadband, and like what impact they may have on sort of like the skills that they develop or just their information seeking behaviors in terms of like, I may have broadband, but like some people have broadband and other people have, sort of dial-up plus, right?
Yeah. So I can address that later. Yes.
One more.
I have just an observation and for something about different countries. And I was recently at a conference where somebody made a presentation about how their father was in hospital in India and how they were using different platforms to try to get a hospital bed, oxygen, and these kinds of things. And it reminded me also of being in India at that time. And then it was really like how it was very concrete inequality, very concrete access to resources that were mediated by access to digital platforms, where in the first lockdown, it was about being able to get food or get food to people. And then in the second wave, it was about getting basic treatment.
Thank you.
Wonderful, well, thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much.